On this lecture, I want to begin talking about some of the darker sides of Vietnamese history and Vietnamese culture. Because my theme is that in this 300-year period, which we're going to go from really 1479 to 1802, 1500 to 1800, it's about 300 years. It's going to be a time of disillusion, of war, of breakdown, of the falling apart of this sense of being Vietnamese that we talked about in the first two lectures. If you recall, we talked about in the first lecture the emergence of a Vietnamese sense of themselves under, well, before Chinese rule and during 1,000 years of Chinese rule. So that when the Vietnamese asserted themselves in 939, they had a sense of who they were as a people with a special sense of destiny, a special set of values around sort of Buddhism and yin-yang thinking, and a strong sense of identity and autonomy. And this sense of being Vietnamese was supported, first of all, it supported two dynasties, the Lý and the Trung, was also developed by the Lý and the Trung into a very strong, vibrant state. And then we saw there was weakness at the end of the Trung dynasty, around 1400, and the Ming Chinese came and conquered Vietnam and ruled, but they couldn't hold the rule because this Vietnamese sense of autonomy and of destiny and of hard work was so strong that the Vietnamese were able to tire out the Ming, defeat them militarily, until the Ming gave up in 1428 and went home. And then the Lê dynasty, L-E, the Lê dynasty, under the leader of Lê Loi, came into power. Now, the first 30 years of the Lê dynasty, under the influence of the great Mandarin Nguyen Khai, whom I talked about last time, I argue continued this primary sort of Buddhist notion of the Lý dynasty and the Trung dynasty. But Nguyen Khai began to bring in some of the ideas and the words and the images from Confucius and Mencius in China. Under these two words in Vietnamese, which are Nhung Nghia, in Vietnamese it's Ren Y, and Nhung is a concept of humaneness, of compassion, of caring about other people, of being a moral person. Nghia is a question or an issue or a value or a practice. Usually it's translated into English as righteousness. It's also related to having different positions. Nghia is respecting your obligations to other people. So a husband has Nghia vis-a-vis a wife. A wife has Nghia vis-a-vis a husband. A child has Nghia vis-a-vis parents. Parents have some sense of Nghia vis-a-vis their children and their own parents. And citizens are supposed to have a sense of Nghia towards the king and towards the country. So if you have these two concepts of Nhung Nghia, you're as a person, you're using your own sort of personal morality, responsibility, and decency as the basis for your relationship in society and the basis for your success. Now, we also talked about previously this Vietnamese belief that if you are a good person, you will inherit Phúc Đức, you will have merit, and that will lead to merit virtue in future incarnations. And so there's a close connection in Vietnamese between your own personal sense of goodness and morality and the power and wealth and happiness that you have in your life. And it all focuses again on a sense of individualism, because it's the individual who's supposed to have Nhung Nghia, not the family, not the state, not the parents, not the wife, not the husband, but the individual. And it's the individual who's the bearer of fate, of destiny, of the things that happen in life. So things happen to you because of you, not because of your family or things like this. With one exception, there's a deep belief in Vietnam that mothers have a very, very powerful role. And so the expression put down by Nguyen Khai under the Lê dynasty is that Phúc Đức tai mạo, your Phúc Đức comes from your mother. You may have it, it's related to you, but the great source of your Phúc Đức comes from your mother. Now, after Nguyen Khai dies, there are several short reigns of Lê kings, and then there's a famous Lê king, one of the most famous kings in Vietnamese history. and his name is Lê Thanh Tông. And he reigns from 1459 to 1492, I think. And he begins the process of the second phase of Vietnamese history, which we're going to talk about today. And that process is bringing in more of a system from China and backing away from this traditional Vietnamese value system, belief system, and set of practices. And the distinction is between a Vietnamese system which is rooted in individual moral character and a Chinese system which is rooted in formal obedience to the family and to the state. And if the two words for the Vietnamese system are like nhân nghĩa, the two words for the Chinese system, or the one word really, is hiếu, filial piety. And that's usually also said as hiếu nghĩa, the righteousness that comes from being filial. Now, this concept of filial piety, I would argue, comes from China, was made important by the Sung dynasty. It does not really go back to Confucius and Mencius that much. Most people in the West, most older Vietnamese scholars, most Chinese, associate hiếu, this concept of filial piety, with Confucius. But if you actually read Confucius in the Analects, he doesn't talk about it very much. He talks more about nhân nghĩa, and Mencius is very explicit that Mencius only talks about nhân nghĩa. Something happened in China after Confucius and Mencius. And what it was a desire to have order, to have structure and order and obedience. So the Chinese came up with two things that were intertwined. An ethical philosophy of filiality, of being filial, being submissive, being subordinate, hiếu, and an administrative state where the emperor was on top and gave orders, and everybody all the way down to the lowest citizen had to listen and obey. So the primary function of a good person in China was obedience. The primary function of a good person in traditional Vietnam was to develop your autonomy as a strong moral person, where you didn't really have to listen to other people. But now under this king, Lê Thanh Tông, things are going to start to change in Vietnam. And this Chinese idea of being filial and Chinese practices and Chinese justifications are going to come into Vietnam, and they're going to create tension. They're going to lead to kind of a breakup of the ability of the Vietnamese to get along with each other and work together well. And so what we're going to see from about 1500 to 1800 is fighting. Lots of fighting. Secondly, what we see is families begin to emerge. Family units, clans, become more important than the nation, than being loyal to Vietnam, than serving the people. What you start to serve is the family. Now, the emphasis on the family is very Chinese, because filial piety goes to the notion of serving the patriarchy. Remember, we said Vietnamese come more from a Southeast Asian tradition where there's the importance of mothers. Chinese, it's the importance of fathers and discipline and order within the family. So now we have this period in Vietnam, 1500 to 1800, where there's kind of a tension and conflict arising between individual Vietnamese who still have some commitment to the old ways and these new Chinese patterns which say you have to be submissive. And what happens, I suggest, in this period of tension is that there's no resolution. Some Vietnamese go this way, other Vietnamese go that way. There's not a strong sense of coming together into one community. By the end of the period, we are going to see the modern state of Vietnam come into being, because one family from here is going to conquer all this area down here. At the same time, 3 different regions are going to emerge with their own identities and differences. There's known as Bắc Hà, or the north. Then there's the Miền Trung, the center. And then there's Nam Ha, or Miền Nam, the south. And they each have 3 different personalities evolve. The personality of Bắc Hà goes all the way back to the beginning of the Vietnamese people and state here. the personality of the center is being formed during all these wars. Because most of the wars, the fighting is going to be right along here. And then the personality of the South is shaped by the fact that one of these clans conquers all this land from the Cambodians. And this is not a land which is ruled by a lot of good, disciplined Vietnamese government. It's very much kind of a Wild West environment where people are on their own to get their own rice fields and develop as they want. So by the time we get to 1802, we have a Vietnam which has experienced 300 years of war and fighting, and there's lots of tension. Tension at the level of ideas, tension among the different regions of Vietnam, and rivalries among families. Now, it starts actually under the reign of this, as I said, very famous and very accomplished king, Le Thanh Tông. Now, one of the things he did was he conquered this part of what is now Vietnam. This is the kingdom of Champa. He basically extinguished the kingdom of Champa. There are still Cham people who live along here. But it was Le Thanh Tông, in 1460, the southern border of Vietnam was roughly here. And he invaded and he conquered the Cham kingdom and added this coastal area to Vietnam. The mountain highlands, nobody was really up there. Those were just highland tribal people living up in the mountains, not responding to any king or leadership on their own. But Le Thanh Tông brings the Vietnamese state down to here. And he begins to justify himself in the state in more Confucian terms. For example, in 1471, he adopts in Vietnam something that the founder of the Ming dynasty in China had done. And the Ming dynasty in China had followed the Neo-Confucian ethic. And this was a practice that very frequently the village chief had to assemble all the village people, and the village chief had to read out principles of Confucian behavior to remind all the Vietnamese what was right and what was wrong. But these principles did not come from Buddhism. These principles did not come from the Le or the Trung dynasty. They were not stories of the ancient Vietnamese heroes and heroines. They were not discussions of how to get your phuc duc. They were things they were the following principles, which the king said, I have ordered these things. Number one, parents are to raise their children to know propriety. That's a Chinese concept. Vietnamese is lei. It's Chinese. Propriety is a structured relationship. That is Confucian, but it gets more strong under the Neo-Confucians. And to find employment. The head of the family, which would be a man, the father, had to observe the utmost correct behavior to set an example and would be punished for the wrongdoing of his household members. That's a Chinese legalist idea. It means I and the father will be punished if one of my sons steals a water buffalo. You don't necessarily punish the son, who's the actual criminal. You get somebody else who's supposed to be in charge, and basically you say, you watch out after your son, or we're going to punish you. So this is a disciplinary system. It doesn't actually go to who generally was the good person or the bad person. It says, you have a job to keep order in your family. Husbands and wives need to respect each other. Children are to love each other and stay at peace with the neighbors. Sick or wounded strangers should be cared for. Women who misbehaved had to accept the criticism of their parents and husbands and should not run away. That strikes me as kind of a Vietnamese thing. Widows could not take young men in their house as adopted sons. Women should not seize family property after their husbands died when they were children from the husband's prior marriage or by a minor wife. Now that strikes me, that's very Vietnamese. When a husband died and there was no child, the wife should not move back to her parents' house with all the couple's property. So here are three things imposing Chinese norms to support the husband against Vietnamese practices where the women were obviously taking over the property, taking everything as soon as their husband died, and going off on their own, or bringing in some younger guy to be a friend. Number 10, the woman's duty is to follow their husband, obey their parents, and avoid quarrels with their in-laws. That's classical Chinese Confucianism. The learned must study conscientiously and not use the power of those above them to oppress others. That was a problem in China too. Clerks must only keep the books and records and must not use cunning to confuse what is written down. In other words, government officials are supposed to do their job and not threaten people by saying, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to put you down, your son has to be a soldier, or we're going to tax you more, or something like that. Merchants must only sell at normal times and not take advantage of disasters or emergencies. Officials and commoners must be filial to parents, dutiful with siblings, and work hard at agriculture. Marriages and funerals should be celebrated according to ritual and regulations within the family means. There's always a problem. Don't spend too much money on weddings. Don't let them get too expensive. Or funerals. During festivals, men and women must not stand or sit next to each other. We don't want a lot of this hanky-panky going on. You know, we got to have good, strict Confucian morality here. And people who run hotels must not abuse women who are traveling. And officials must ensure that men and women do not bathe together along the same stretch of beach or lake. Right? So this is Lei Tan Tong. And again, in a very filial way, in the way of the Chinese educated mandarins, he was a scholar, he studied, and he wrote poetry, very good poetry. But also in very Chinese tradition, he did not like business people. Because this Neo-Confucian tradition saw business people motivated by self-interest, by greed, by profit, and therefore they would twist the rules and they would not be filial. They would not be orderly. They would upset things in order to make money. So Lei Tan Tong wrote this poem about business people. They bustle on sand beaches night and day. They bring back goods which cram their houses full. A lizard's heart will scheme to snitch and snatch. A viper's tongue can use and speak fine words. Their ill-gotten wealth is made throughout the land. Their venal motives serve as the butt of songs. Compare, how do they differ from mere cheats? It's strange that men could sell to fellow men. In his vision, buying and selling free enterprise, doing what you want, building up your own wealth, exercising the benefits of your fupduk, oh, very messy, very disorganized. He wanted everybody to be very sort of structured in positions. But here are two poems he writes about himself. The people's welfare is our first concern. High heaven's mandate we dare not neglect. Drums beat a night watch shift. We still read books. The sun is going down, yet we hold court. In crisis, able men reveal themselves. To circumstances, wise policies adapt. Don't say the gold-robed person does no work. Reports on all state matters reach his ear. And then on the conduct of kings. Ponder the ruler's way with utmost care. Feed men on earth, fear heaven throned above. Protect the realm, walk in the ancient steps. Cleanse cravings from the heart, go on no hunt. Wide choice of talents spreads the scholar's faith. Weapons in plenty build a soldier's pride. Light your jade torch and see your subjects' needs. May we and all our neighbors live in peace. So in these poems, we see that Lei Tan Tong is modeling himself on traditional Chinese, the traditional Chinese virtue of the emperor who listens to heaven above and is the father of the people and takes care of all the people through law and order and regulation. Now, Lei Tan Tong dies in 1497, and there's no strong successor. In the next 20 years, there are 10 different kings, and the head of a family, Mak Dang-yum, becomes the powerful guy within the Lei palace. And his first noted ancestor, Mak Din Chi, was one of the first Vietnamese to test under the Trung dynasty as a Confucian scholar. So the Mak family has always associated themselves with Chinese learning, with mastery of the Chinese classics, and with Chinese values. In 1527, Mak Dang-yum overthrows the Lei ruler. Just says, move aside, and and makes himself emperor and establishes the Mac dynasty around his family. But other families and the people do not accept the Mac. Another family comes up, and this is the Nguyen, and this family is going to be influential down through 1945. And the Nguyen, the first Nguyen, Nguyen Kim, in 1533, he restores the Lei to the throne, but he does it down here in Thanh. The Mac still control the heartland. So what we're now seeing is a shift of leadership to people who come from this region here, Thanh and Nghệ An. And by the way, Lei Lai of the Lei dynasty came out of here. So the Mac are up here, the Nguyen are from here. Another family is going to emerge, the Trinh, they're also from here. So the Mac are here, and the Lei are ruling, but the Nguyen have the power. It's the Nguyen who control the mandarins, who raise the troops, who run the armies. Now, the Mac get to stay up here until 1592. Then the Lei dynasty, pushed by the Nguyen and the Trinh, defeat them, and they have to move up to Cao Bang, up here. Now the Mac, in order to get support against the Nguyen and the Trinh and the Lei, they turn to the Chinese emperor. Now this is, I think, it's really only the first time that a Vietnamese political leader, a Vietnamese political group, has turned to the Chinese for help, because they need help against other Vietnamese. There's kind of like a civil war going on between these clans. So the Mac are recognized by the Chinese, they adopt more and more Chinese law and customs, and they surrender some land up here to China. In doing this, historians feel, they alienated the Vietnamese people, because the Vietnamese people don't want to support a leader who, if you will, is subservient to the Chinese. And the Mac do not call themselves Dai Viet or any of these nationalist names. It's a very similar phenomenon to what we saw before with this man Ho Quy Ly. He came after the Trung dynasty, and he didn't talk about Vietnamese nationalism. He just talked about himself. And he used some Chinese values and Chinese mandarins, Chinese style mandarins to help him. And the Ming dynasty invaded, and the Vietnamese people did not rally to him. They wouldn't fight for Ho Quy Ly. Now they don't really like the Mac. So the Mac are going to get pushed out here, where they survive in a little area here until 1677. Now, after the Mac are being defeated, the Nguyen family here have a son-in-law, and his name is Trinh Kiam. He marries a Nguyen daughter. He's a son-in-law. He now goes for power. And there's a split between the Trinh family and the Nguyen family. And one of the Nguyen, Nguyen Wang, will get some help from a famous fortune teller, who we'll talk about for quite a bit. And the fortune teller gives him a clue that says, go to the south. In the south, you can have your rule, your freedom, your autonomy. So what he does, this guy Nguyen Wang, is he moves down here. He goes even farther down here. And he takes this land as his sort of territory. And this is in the middle of the 1500s, by the late 1500s. So like it's about 100 years. We've had the Lei get weak, the Mac usurp the throne, the Nguyen support the Lei to fight the Mac. Now we're going to have another 100 years, 1600 to 1700, and the Nguyen are going to set up a state down to here, and the Trinh are going to take over all this. The Nguyen are going to build 2 walls right here, and there are going to be 7 different wars between 1620 and 1670, as the Nguyen clan down here and the Trinh clan up here fight each other to destroy the other and take over Vietnam, but neither can do it. Now, what is one of the things that happens here? One of the things that happens is that there's a kind of change in the attitude of mandarins, in the attitude of intellectuals. which has lasted down until the present time. Down to this period, poets, intellectuals, Buddhist priests, everybody, the whole idea, I think, I would argue, was to serve the people, serve the nation, support the king, get out and do something, become famous, help the country. Now what we see is these kinds of people, they back away. They don't want to be in politics. They don't want to support this family or that family. And they kind of retreat, and they become like hermits, and they become poets, and they worry about great philosophical issues, because politics is sort of selfish and dirty and mean and nasty. And so there's a separation, there's a breakdown, a separation out between the intellectual leadership of the people and the political leadership. And one of this famous guy is Nguyen Binh Kim, whose name is Trang Trinh. He was sort of the great intellectual figure in the 1500s. As Vietnam is breaking down into struggles between these clans, he becomes the great figure, and he writes 100 poems in the Vietnamese characters, Chu Nom. He writes 1,000 poems in Chinese characters. And most importantly, he writes something called a sum. He has the Sum Trang Trinh, which is up on the internet. We just printed this out here, which is a fairly long poem with all kinds of mystical implications. And since he wrote this about 1565, I think, and since then, Vietnamese have been looking to this poem to predict the future. And one of the things that's been going on recently is people are trying to find in this poem the year when the communists are going to collapse in Vietnam. And one of the famous lines in here, don't see it offhand, is that in some year of Yao, in some year of the chicken, Vietnam will see peace. And so every time you come up to a Yao year, the question is this the Yao year that Trang Trinh was talking about? Is this the Yao year when the bad guys are going to start to go down and the good guys are going to start to come up? But he's got lots of lines in here, and you have to be really sophisticated and subtle, and you have to know the meaning of words and old references, and there's double entendres and triple entendres. Where one word can potentially refer to 2 or 3 other things. And if you analyze all that, you're very good. Now, I wanted to read you some of his poems, because I think they're dramatic, and they give you a sense of his sadness, his frustration, and it's an insight. It's a very deep insight into some powerful Vietnamese thinking, which you can get from a lot of people. It's reflected in contemporary poetry. It's in songs. It's in personalities. Now, he's also living in by the way, he served the MAC. The lay is getting weak. He gets the top degree in the studies. He's a Tiên Sĩ. He's a PhD equivalent in classical studies. The lay family is weak. The MAC asked him to serve, so he serves the MAC as a Mandarin for them for 8 years, and then he leaves. And he goes back to his village in a monastery, in the White Cloud Monastery. So he's living in a time when these Confucian ideas are starting to come in, but as you can see, he's primarily Buddhist and Taoist, and he believes in yin and yang. His whole prognostications are based on yin and yang. Not on the study of history or anything, but projecting out the cycles of yin energy and yang energy. So this is his poem on reading Buddha's scriptures. The Buddha taught the perfect thusness way. O blessings countless as the Ganges sands. The sun and moon whirl past and then come back. All plants and blossoms thrive to wither soon. We live, we die. The richest man will never have enough. A pauper feels his lot's the worst on earth. There's injustice in the world. Within the heart there lies a fallow field. Here's a theme that gets picked up by this poet in Kim Van Q. Within the heart, that's where you can plow your destiny. This is the old notion of your own duk, getting your own duk. Uproot its weeds and grow true wisdom flower. Go inside to your own heart. Tear out the ugly weeds there. Don't worry about politics. Don't worry about society. Take care of yourself. To those who spread nets. The birds and fish are little beasts. Their life or death depends on you. To heaven may all birds take flight, or down to earth may all birds dive. Let them go right if they so wish. Let them turn left if they so choose. They all may stay outside my net, but woe to those who break my laws. Unless all creatures love takes in, how can you learn respect for life? The wounded goldfish Yang had nursed repaid his favor manyfold. The turtle Mao had once set free came back to rescue him from death. A word to those who must spread nets. No wanton killing should be tolerated. The two references to Chinese, but he's saying two things here in this point. One, he's talking about at the level of individual people, of Vietnamese belief in freedom, in individual freedom. This is a point that says if birds want to fly, let them fly. If they want to turn left, let them turn left. If your kids want to go off and do that, let them go. If your father wants to do that, well, he's your father. If some citizen wants to go shopping, the Mall of America, somebody wants to go shopping, let him go shopping. The expression net also refers to politics and government. Because in the old classical Chinese writings, which he probably read, the law is referred to as the net that you throw out to catch and trap people. And the question is whether the threads of the net leave big holes or little holes. If they leave big holes, then people can slip through and have more freedom. If the net is very tightly woven, there's no freedom. We're all trapped. And the Chinese, when they use the term net, they like it. It's the net of the law. That's what you got to have. He's saying here to those of you who throw the nets, you're restricting people's freedom. So here's the Vietnamese in the 1500s who's talking about individual freedom in a way that is very contemporary. And then a word to those who must spread nets is a word to the ruling officials. The Mac, the Nguyen, the Trin have not yet come up yet. No wanton killing. Okay, you want to spread nets? That's your fate. But don't kill people. By the way, this resonates with the whole instinctive Vietnamese attitude about the communists in modern times, because the communists spread nets with a very, very fine mesh, so they can catch and control everybody, and they killed. And so the opposition to communism in Vietnam, as the opposition to French colonial rule, has deep, deep roots. These are some more poems by him at this time of disenchantment. There are three ranks of men, three grades of things. It's wise to know that flowers now bloom, now fade. A feast is spread, awaiting worthy guests. The seat of state lie ready for high skills. Must one let vulgar hands draw heaven's sword? The emperor's supposed to only one who has the sword of heaven. Vulgar hands. He's saying, why are these people in Vietnam who want to be king, why are they vulgar? Why are they cheap? Why are they corrupt? Why are they cruel? They want to grab the sword of heaven. Should wicked rascals hone the crescent axe? The axe is the symbol of authority and punishment. All-seeing majesty shines there on high. It's up in heaven. Does anyone need cry and hawk pure gold? You really have to go out there for money and power and family wealth and prestige? Is that what life is all about? There's a chicken's egg. A chicken's egg, not round, nor is it square, yet it enfolds both heaven and earth. Outside, the primal stuff in two white layers. Inside, some ochre with a yellow dot. The great ultimate, that's the combination of yin and yang, taikuk, starts as one mixed blend. It starts as yin and yang together, then it busts open, and yin goes one way and yang goes the other way. When yin and yang conjoin, get back together again, a chick will hatch. Upon fledged wings it soars and meets the clouds. The golden rooster will assist the sun. Now, this is sort of a prediction here. When yin and yang come back together in Vietnam, at some point, then a great king will emerge, a chick will hatch, and it will soar up and meet the clouds. It will rise up like a dragon. But it's not going to happen in Vietnam until yin and yang come together, until the time is right. This is fatalism. This is, again, a continuation of this old Vietnamese thinking, this old Vietnamese consciousness. But remember, Trang Trinh is in a monastery on a mountain. He's not in government anymore. And the golden rooster will assist the sun. And the rooster is a yang being. And the sun, daylight, sunlight is a yang force. And yang is usually the expression of the male, of virtue, of kingship. So they have to wait for yin and yang to come together, for some great yang force to emerge in some individual human being who will be blessed by heaven and will solve Vietnam's problems. This is expressing what I feel. A phase of yin has passed. Now comes a yang. Things go in cycles. Constant is the law. A raging rainstorm never lasts all day. Dried twigs of thin bamboos will dread raw frost. Believe that gain can yet result in loss. If you win, if things are good for you today, if you got a lot of money, you got power, remember, things can change. You can fall. Nothing is permanent. Good leads to bad, but bad can also lead to good. Who knows that gentleness may conquer force? To fathom nature's way of life and death, study the chart of the great ultimate, the Tai Kuk, the yin and yang. So this brings to mind a true story with one of my older colleagues and mentors. His pen name was Pham Thai. His real name was Nguyen Ngap Tung. He was the 8th person to join the Dai Viet Party in Vietnam in, I think, 1938. Now, he was from the South. He came out of a family which had been involved in the Wahao, in the Hungia sect coming down from the Busang, Ki Hug. And he was an older man running for politics. This would have been 71, I think, something like that. So I'm at his house, and he's complaining about the Americans, that we always support these inadequate people, like Nguyen Van Thieu and Nguyen Cao Ky and all these people. And the Vietnamese can only defeat the communists when they get some guy coming out who's got the right destiny. And I said, because I knew a little bit about this, I said, so Tay, so we have to wait for somebody with a good tuk, a good facial feature and the right show? And he said, yes. And I said, how much longer do the Vietnamese have to wait? And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, Tay, I have to tell you that I'm an American. And as I look in Vietnamese history, you got 4,000 years, and you got 4 guys. Actually, you only have 3.5. Because the 4th, whom we're going to talk about, Quang Trung Nguyen Huai, some people, not everybody agrees with him. So I said, on average, that's like 1 guy every 1,000 years. And he says, yeah. And I said, well, I'm an American. I mean, we like to get things done in 24 hours, And he sort of looks at me, and he's Vietnamese. Going back to this kind of attitude that's expressed when all these political leaders are basically, none of them are really impressive. None of them are worthwhile. They're all squabbling for power and money, and they have soldiers and all this kind of stuff, and they're killing people, and they're fighting with each other. What does a good person do? And this has been a source of angst and unhappiness, I would submit, for Vietnamese for a long time, because there's no good answer. If you go off with these guys, you're not a good person, maybe. 2, you're probably going to get stepped on. If you stay back, if you just go to the village, or you go to the pagoda or something like that, or you write poems, or you go have coffee with your friends in the morning, you go to the Ai Weiwei coffee house up here and you have a great time, sharing poems back and forth and stuff, are you really helping the community? But you're waiting for destiny because you have no power. It's all up to the Tai Kuk. Maybe we should put that up, Tai Kuk. Yeah, you got it. Okay, great. So what are you? You're just a little person. You know, what are you going to do on this? Another poem, well, it comes, I think maybe I'll talk about it now. It's a little bit later chronologically. But there's another famous Vietnamese poem, the Chinh Phu Ngâm, about this period. And it's a poem written by two men, but it's the voice of a wife, of a woman, whose husband is off in the war. And it's pretty depressing. Because what this poem says is that I have no idea I haven't heard from you for years. I have no idea whether you're alive or dead. I don't know what battlefield you're on. I assume you're fighting the enemy, you're doing great things, you're using your sword, you're a great hero. Let me tell you how lonely I am. Let me tell you how miserable I am. I'm sitting here waiting. Maybe sometime before we die, we'll meet each other again. But we'll maybe only have, a few short months together as old people, when all the youth and passion and love and sex and children and all that stuff is gone. We had no opportunity. You went off to the war, I stayed here. But I'm telling you in this poem, which you will never read probably, I'm making up a little bit up, that I love you passionately and completely, and I will always be faithful. So you read this thing, you sort of say, geez, it's kind of depressing. Well, remember, Vietnamese, I mean, they're fighting from about 1527, you know, all the way down. There's 100 years in here in the early 18th century where there's not a lot of wars. But there's some sense here. There's a dynamic that's set in, which is not the dynamic of the Li and the Trung and the early Lei dynasty, of a state which is at peace, which has good kings and good government. Something else is going on. Now, let me turn to, very briefly, before we break, the 1600s. What I've been talking about are the 1500s. In the 1600s, this 100 years, we have some very, very powerful and big things happening. One of which is these wars, these 7 different, they call them wars, but what they really are military campaigns, between the Nguyen here and the Trinh up here, starting in 1620, going to 1622. About every 10 years, one of these families mobilizes 100,000 soldiers and comes down to, and mostly it's the Trinh coming down to try to defeat the Nguyen. The Nguyen are fighting defensive wars behind ramparts, and they basically hold off the Trinh. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. In 1672, the leader of the Trinh family basically sort of gives up, and he says, we can't conquer these guys. So we have wars. We also have the Nguyen starting, well, we have wars here, and 2 things start to happen. One, the Trinh bring in officially more and more Chinese norms, Chinese patterns. They need a basis to rule. Secondly, the government loses control of the villages. During the 1600s, the Vietnamese here under the Trinh are living in autonomous village communities under family leaders and and they don't listen to the government. They just have to send up taxes, and they have to send out some soldiers from time to time. Law is breaking down. Powerful people are coming up. Families are looking after themselves. They're gaining power, rice lands. They want to dominate in village councils. What's important is not individual morality so much anymore. What's important is power and wealth. The Trinh respond to this by bringing in Confucian values and virtues. Because they themselves, the Trinh, they don't have this old Vietnamese virtue. They don't have Huy Tin, this Vietnamese concept of Huy Tin, of an individual person who has so much charisma, benefits from Phuc Duc, has virtue, Duc, is trustworthy, cares about the people, is honest, is compassionate. They don't have this. They know that ordinary people don't respect them, don't want to follow them. So they bring in this Chinese notion of obedience, filial piety, because that's how they try to support their rule. And they also try to bring in the Chinese culture of the patriarchal family, where everybody has to support the fathers, and they want to make an alliance with the clans. So they'll go to the big families and say, look, we'll kind of support you. You send your sons out to fight for us when we need soldiers. The Nguyen dynasty down here, they do not use the Confucian teachings at all. They use material incentives. They use basically self-interest. Because what they do is they say to Vietnamese, look, you want land? Come down here, we'll give you land. You're poor, you're oppressed up here under the Trinh. Get on a boat, come down here, we'll open up plantations. Don Dien. We'll open up colonies and plantations, and you can come down, and if you're a hard worker and you're an entrepreneurial type, you can build up your fortune and bring your family with you. So this is called the Nam Tien, the movement to the south. So bit by bit by bit, groups of Vietnamese recruited by the Nguyen start coming down and building little villages and taking over rice lands in the land from the Cham and then bit by bit the Cambodians. At the end of the 1600s, there's a big change in China. The Ming dynasty collapses, and it's a dynasty of Chinese people. And a new dynasty comes to power called the Qing. And these people are not Chinese. These people are Manchus. They come from Manchuria. And they create this Qing dynasty. And they ask all the Chinese mandarins to swear an oath of loyalty to the new dynasty. And many, many Chinese refuse to do this. Some on Confucian grounds, or Neo-Confucian grounds. Because Neo-Confucianism teaches under filial piety, in one life you can only be loyal to one emperor. No betrayal. If you're loyal to your emperor, you've got to follow them. Secondly, there were a lot of Chinese who didn't want to be ruled by a foreign people, by the Manchus. So a number of Chinese fled, and a number of them came to Vietnam. Some of you who come from Hue, you might know about the Minh Huong people. They're Chinese descendants of Chinese who came here in 1670, 1680 to around Hue, and they lit incense, Hung, to the Ming court, the ancestors of the Ming. That's what they're called, Minh Huong people. And bit by bit, they intermarried with Vietnamese during the 1800s. Another group of Ming come down here to Ha Tien. They make a very powerful little mini-state down here. And the Nguyen dynasty welcomes all these people. Because they say, come, help us build up our power down here. The next big thing that happens, which we'll talk about after the break, is Christianity arrives. In the 1600s, the Catholics arrive. And they come to Vietnam really very strongly about 1620. So as the Vietnamese people are fighting these different wars, as they've got these rulers whom they really don't respect, as their philosophy is this sense of almost despair, I would say, and resignation, a new religion shows up, and a lot of Vietnamese turn to this new religion, because we'll talk about that in a little while. So we're seeing as the sort of the traditional Vietnamese state and enthusiasm breaks down. We have more and more things coming in from China, and we have a religion coming in from the Europeans. At the same time as the political state is breaking down and people are relying more and more on power and self-interest to get their way in life. So thank you very much, and we'll come back in a little bit. back to the 1600s. And this is the period that I said that there are these 7 brutal military campaigns between the Trinh and the Nguyen along here. And the Trinh are trying to develop their own control, but they're losing control of the people. The Vietnamese people are going off on their own, following their own values, their own beliefs. So, for example, under the Trinh, there are only 500 officials in their central administration. This is 10% of the officials that the Lê king, Lê Thanh Tôm, had. So they don't even have enough officials to really sort of run the government. What they have done is they have kept in place the emperor from the Lê family and the traditional 6 ministries. They have assumed the title of Chúa or Lord, and they set up a Phiên, which is a little control branch to watch over the ministries. So what they have is a Vietnamese version of the Japanese shogunate, the shogun. The shogun in Japan was a military leader who had all the power, but the emperor of Japan was technically the ruler. But the emperor couldn't do anything unless the shogun approved, and basically the shogun ran things. So the Trinh basically ran things, and when they needed the king to sign some imperial rescript, they'd send it over to him and he'd have to sign it. And if the kings got in the way, they were removed. Emperor King Tôm was forced into suicide in 1619. U Tôm was forced to abdicate 1729. Duy Phuong was killed in 1732. And Y Tôm was forced to give up the throne in 1740. But now, the traditional pattern of rule for both Vietnam and China was that there had to be lists of all the villagers. They had to list every citizen, every householder, and based on those lists, you pay taxes, and men were recruited for the army. If a government could not maintain the list, the government was very weak. It couldn't get enough taxes out of the villages, and it couldn't get enough soldiers. So what we see is the Trinh are unable to complete the lists at the village level. The lists are supposed to be done every 3 years. In 1660, the Trinh Lord decided that they would only do it once every 10 years. He doesn't have enough people to control the villages. In 1660, the census, like we just had in the United States of America this year in 2010, in 1664 it was decided that each village would have a fixed population figure for the purposes of military conscription. Because they just decided every village is going to have to produce 10 guys or 15 guys or 20 guys, regardless of how many men were actually there. So they didn't know what was going on in the villages. In 1646, it was ordered by the Trinh that all lawsuits over marriage, civil status, or land had to be brought to the village chief first. In other words, if you had a lawsuit, you couldn't go to the government officials. You had to go to the village chief. Well, what happens if the village chief doesn't like your family? What kind of a deal are you going to get in justice at the village level? 1649, there is a law against all private persons who are setting up their own tax collection points on the roads. Now, is there a bunch of tough guys who are just going out on the main roads and say, you want to pass? Pay me some money. It's called banditry. The government isn't even strong enough to provide security on the roads for people. So they pass a law. Stop that. Don't do it. If I ever see you doing that again, I will spank you. In 1657, village chiefs were told they could no longer punish the relatives of a robber and destroy his family's property. Village chiefs, apparently, because since the government couldn't take care of robbers, the village chiefs were organizing little military bands of their own, and they were taking care of the robbers. But they were being too cruel about it. So the state says, you're being too cruel and don't take our job. But the government is ineffective. In 1650, a law was enacted forbidding local officials to set themselves up as private judges to decide cases. So you got some village chief local officials, there's no decent justice you can get. So I and my retainers, my sons, my uncles, the people we're gonna be the boss of the village. You want to get a dispute settled? 2 women fighting in the marketplace, come to me, I'll settle it. You don't settle it with me, I'll have my guys go beat up your guys. This is not a happy situation. 1663, powerful people in the villages were forbidden to replace the village chief as the one who would decide lawsuits. So a few years later, it's not even the village chief appointed by the state who's deciding law. It's just some big shot family. Some guy decides he's a tough guy. It's his village. He's got sons-in-laws and daughters-in-law and all this, so he ought to be the number one. And he's going to decide all the cases. 1667, villages in the provinces of Thenwa and Nghệ, right in here. These are tough-minded people, by the way, from then to the present time. Refused to assist central government officials in locating public lands. Government wants to find public. Some of the lands were private, but some were public. And the local village said, no, you don't come in our village. In 1684, these same villages refused to implement the military draft. They said, we're not going to send our guys to be soldiers for you. In 1637, well, there was an issue of, at some point, the public lands. In each village had been a system where public land was allocated among poor people on a rotating basis. And that had been traditionally done by the government, the state. Under this period, it's no longer done. It's taken over by villages. Also in 1663, we have a note that the villages where the bride lived were demanding a contribution from a non-resident groom before they would let him take his bride home with him. Remember, the new marriage culture is if I kodong's out, you got to go to the house of the bride and officially request her from her family and take it back to your family to enter into your patrilineage if you are the groom. So what villages are saying is, wait a moment, this is a daughter from our village. You want a daughter from our village, you got to pay us some money. You don't pay money, you don't get the girls from our village. So the villagers are taking over, and we have this phrase that has come down that phép vua tua lei lang. The emperor's order falls before the rules and customs of the village. So power in Vietnam is decentralizing down to a village level. 1719, Lord Trinh Quang worries about the lack of accurate census. They haven't done the census since 1669. So, but it takes him 5 years to make an order. In 1724, it was decided to carry out an accurate census every 3 years. But then in 1730, it was decided to do it every 12 years. They can't even get the census properly done, the Trinh. Now, shifting on how the Trinh dealt with such decentralization of power. They more and more tried to neo-Confucianize Vietnam. In 1663, remember, this is the very same year when they're saying the villages are getting too much power. The Trinh ordered that on every Lunar New Year's Day, village and hamlet's chiefs were to assemble the people, and they have to read out 57 moral maxims. If you remember, Lê Thanh Tôn had borrowed this idea from the Ming Chinese, but I think he only had like 13. No, he had 18. Now the Trinh come out with 57. And these maxims reflected a more orthodox approach. They began, number one, is that subjects must be completely loyal and devoted to the emperor. Number two, children must show filial piety to their parents. So as the Trinh regime is unable to get the loyalty of the people and to get their support and to govern, they impose these moral obligations for obedience. Then the Trinh outlaw, or they restrict who can become a Buddhist. That's in line with Neo-Confucian teachings. No one can consult fortune tellers or evade taxes. No Buddhist temples could be built. Books containing Buddhist, Taoist, and other unorthodox doctrines could not be printed or sold, which technically means that the poems of Nguyen Binh Khiem that we read could not be printed or sold because they're very Buddhist or Taoist. So here you have an intellectual tradition where the intellectuals are keeping Buddhism and Taoism, and the state is saying it's ideological control and censorship, saying and very much like what the Chinese government was doing under some Neo-Confucians. Say we're not letting you think aright the way you want to think aright. Novels in the vernacular script, Junom, the Vietnamese script used to write down the Vietnamese language, could not be sold. Only you could have Chinese classics. Witches and fortune tellers were to be arrested. In 1665, the Trinh government outlawed cockfighting, gambling, and spirit worship. I mean, these are things Vietnamese have been doing and still doing. One of the passions of Air Vice Marshal Nguyen Cao Ky was cockfighting. Spirit worship is like been doing that since the mountains and the rivers. If you don't worship the mountains and the rivers, how can you be a Vietnamese? In 1680, they outlawed the practice of geomancy, of relocating the graves of ancestors to improve the fortune of descendants. And I talked about how President Thieu moved his grandfather's grave to get a better fortune. Not very Neo-Confucian. So they outlawed it. But do you think the Vietnamese people gave up geomancy, fortune-telling, cockfighting, gambling, Buddhism? So now you have a government in the position of issuing orders which the people don't obey. That's a very difficult position for a government to be in, because it shows a fundamental lack of power, but more deeply, lack of legitimacy and lack of respect. So they, in 1718, there's a government rescript about how Vietnam is a wonderful place because it has a superior man sent by heaven who radiated moral virtue from the throne, invigorated everything, and made the blessings of peace possible. However, there's another report I found in one of the histories that said, ignorant and stupid people are provoked by others at the slightest breach. They are pushed and incited by those whose means of livelihood are to stir up lawsuits, and who cannot refrain from going to court. Examining magistrates do not see through to the stubbornness involved, or else do not clearly set aside malicious slander, so that the wily slip through the net of the law. Those who stir up suits continue to spread their malicious words. Those who have taken a wrong way have no one to show them the right way. Those who are right must suffer unjust injury. The expense of litigation daily mounts. The mutual grievances daily increase. The officials set themselves up above the people as if they were people of China looking down on the people of Viet. Now here's a guy writing, is an official, writing about 1720 or so, who's basically making the analogy that our mandarins, they think they're Chinese, superior Chinese ruling the sort of peasant, barbarian, uncouth Vietnamese. So here you have a division, a social division brought into Vietnam by the 1720s based on a Chinese model as a superior, morally superior model over a Vietnamese model. Orthodoxy had arrived. And I think you can sense that doesn't work well for a community to get together. You've got an elite which has a sort of foreign ideology as the basis of its rule, focusing in on families and clans which are fighting with each other at the national level and at the village level, and your intellectuals and your moral force is retreating back privately, and the core religious views of the people, Buddhism, Taoism, spirit worship, yin and yang, are not sanctioned or legitimated by the government. So who shows up at this time? The Christians, the West. The Western expansionism, right, begins in the late 1400s, and the first sort of major intrusion is the Spaniards, who come to the Philippines over here in 1521. And they then begin a process of turning the Philippines into a colony. In the 1520s, there's a competition between the Spaniards and the Portuguese. These are the first two European powers to really have global influence with their ships. The British, the Dutch, and the French are going to come later. And they argue over who gets to carry the word of Christianity. So the Pope decides, and he creates a line. On one half of the line, which was basically from Africa over to Latin America, that was for the Spaniards. They got to spread the word of Christianity. On the other half of the line, which was mostly Asia, it was the Portuguese. And then the Portuguese and the Spaniards got into arguments about the Philippines and which side of the line were they on, because the world goes all the way around, right? You can't take the globe and just cut it in half. A major event, well, the Portuguese in 1522, they establish a colony in Malacca, which is sort of near Singapore. So that's their toehold in Southeast Asia. Very important is in 1546, Francis Xavier, who along with Ignatius Loyola was one of the founders of the Jesuit order, arrives in Asia. And Xavier builds up Jesuit missions in Japan, and they become very important in Asia. The first Catholic church in Da Nang is founded in Vietnam, in Da Nang, in 1615. Now, Hue is the capital. Da Nang is a small commercial center down there. But in 1615, an Italian Catholic shows up, founds a church in Da Nang, and has 300 converts. In 1624, the most famous Catholic, Alexander de Rhodes, arrives, and he's a Jesuit, and he organizes the teaching and the spread of Catholicism in Vietnam. Now, they arrive down here, but he then goes up here to the Trinh realm in 1627. In 3 years, the Trinh ruler throws him out, and the Catholics are persecuted the same way the Buddhists are. There are various rules in coming down that they see Catholicism as a threat to their Neo-Confucian rule. Now, in 3 years, Alexander de Rhodes has got 7,000 converts, which is not that many. On the other hand, it's more than a few. When you think about the Thais, the Christians worked in Thailand for a long, long time, and very few Thais ever converted. Now, the most important thing that Alexander de Rhodes did with his French Jesuit missionaries was to create Quốc ngữ. He created a way of writing Vietnamese using Roman or Latin letters, or Western script. This is the way Vietnamese is written today. This is how all contemporary Vietnamese have learned how to read and speak their own language, Quốc ngữ. And it was created by French missionaries, Jesuit missionaries. And this is a copy of the first book ever printed in Quốc ngữ. It was printed in Rome in 1651. And it's the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Now, it is significant that Alexander de Rhodes was a Jesuit, because the Jesuits had a different approach to the spread of Christianity than other groups like the Dominicans or the Franciscans. The Jesuits tried to get the local culture to adopt, in its own terms, Christian teachings. So they were very interested in learning how to speak Vietnamese, in turning things into the Vietnamese language, and recruiting and training Vietnamese priests. The first seminary is set up, I think, Rhodes sets up the first seminary. By 1700, there are 45 Vietnamese priests. So they want Catholicism to become Vietnamese. The Jesuits do. They don't want to rely just on Dominicans or foreigners who are the men of God to come and do that. They want the Vietnamese to internalize this, which is one reason why they want to get this in a way that Vietnamese can read on their own. So you don't have to go to a church and listen to some preacher talk about it. You can take the catechism to your house, just like a Chinese classic, and you can read it and study it yourself. They report that in 1640, before this, there are 82,000 Catholics here and 42,000 Catholics in the north. Again, not large numbers, but significant. The long-term significance of this is introducing the French to Vietnam. And this will set in motion a train of consequences which will lead to French colonialization in the 19th century, in the 1860s. So the reason that the French get interested in Vietnam comes from, one, Catholicism, but also Alexander de Rhodes, because he's French. He's not Spanish, he's not Portuguese, and he's a Jesuit. And so there are issues with Rome, and there are issues with others. So he needs a patron to help him continue bringing Catholicism to Vietnam. Where does he go? He goes to France. He tries to get the French to take an interest in bringing Catholicism and doing business in Vietnam. And in 1660, the French create a missionary society. It takes them a long time to get back to Vietnam, but they create, and there's a little group of French people from 1660 who are thinking about France's influence and outreach to Vietnam, thanks to Alexander de Rhodes. Now, what is the appeal of Catholicism to the Vietnamese? I want to make some suggestions. At this time in the history of Vietnam, as we pointed out, the traditional Vietnamese beliefs are kind of on the wane. And also, they're delegitimized. Because the traditional Vietnamese belief would say that if we're all good people and fate loves us, we're going to have a good king and we're going to have a good ruler and we'll all have the benefit of peace. There's no good king, there's no good ruler, there's no peace. There are a lot of families throwing their weight around. Something is wrong. What have we done wrong? Why doesn't heaven like us? What has happened to the time? Why are yin and yang out of balance? Why doesn't the Thai cook, as Nguyen Minh Kim says, shower us with good fortune and blessings? Is it maybe we're too selfish, we're too greedy, our ideas are wrong, somebody doesn't like us, the spirits of the mountains, and we can't worship the spirits of the mountains and the rivers the way we used to, they're angry at us, something's going wrong. Belief, self-confidence and belief in your values was probably at a low point. The Trin bring in Chinese Neo-Confucianism. They bring in something from a different cultural framework in order to sort of support their rule. Here's something else that's arriving. And if you don't have a lot of self-confidence in your own values and your state is constant sort of struggle, you may need a new ground for confidence and for believing in heaven. What does Catholicism and Christianity provide? It provides a Son of God. Heaven and one Son. God, Jesus Christ. In the person of Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit, the Holy Ghost, as the Christians talk about it, is a great supernatural power. The Vietnamese for centuries have believed in supernatural powers who are linked to heaven. Secondly, and I suggest this is quite significant, if one looks at a lot of the dynamics, even today, of Vietnamese Catholicism, the role of Mary, the Mother of God, is very, very important. This is a maternal figure. Catholicism, more than Protestantism, offers to the Vietnamese something consistent with their ancient feelings about mothers, a protective mother. And so rather than on the spirit side, you have Ten Mao, you have all these spirit cults about Ten Mao. On the Catholic side, you've got the Virgin Mary. How many of you have been to the annual festival in, where is it, Arkansas? Every year? Missouri. How many Vietnamese go to Missouri? Thousands. From all over America, they go to Missouri. Why, Brandon? Ten Mao. And in Vietnamese, they talk about Ten Mao, which is not a Christian Catholic. That's an old Vietnamese phrase, Ten Mao, the sainted mother. So the Catholics show up with this. Another factor was there was a sickness, an epidemic, and some of the Catholic priests went around giving out holy water, and people got cured, and they didn't die. So apparently a lot of villagers say, hey, what's going on here? Somebody shows up, they've got holy water, they've got heaven, they've got a mother, a sainted mother figure, they've got a Holy Ghost, they've got a leader, Jesus Christ, who, by the way, sacrificed himself for the people. In classic sort of, tradition, you have to sacrifice yourself. You're not sort of like in a Buddhist tradition. So Catholicism sinks some very genuine roots. Now, I just want to read this a little bit. This is Alexander de Rhodes writing a catechism for Vietnamese in 1651, and the first one is Tao Thanh Đức Chúa Trời, the way of the Thanh Đức, of the sainted, virtuous Lord of the sky. So if you're a Vietnamese in 1660 or something, and somebody comes up and starts talking to you about the Tao, well, that's a Chinese Vietnamese word. It's a literal translation of religion. Right, but it's also something you've heard about. I mean, the Tao Tao this, Tao that. The way, it's the way, it's the right way. And then you've got the Thanh Đức. Trung Hung Tao is called Đức Thanh, or Đức Trung, right? So now you've got the Thanh Đức, and he's a Chúa. This guy's a Chúa, he's a Lord, and Trời, not Tiang. Rhodes does not use the Chinese word for heaven. He uses Trời, he doesn't use Tiang. So here these guys are talking up about all the good things that are going to happen to you. Now notice there's another thing about Christianity, which is very close to Buddhism and sort of the Taoist tradition, in that the center of the religion is the individual person. The Vietnamese are coming out of a tradition where fate and destiny and goodness are all about the individual person. And Christianity shows up talking the same way. It's your own fate, it's your own salvation. It's not your family, it's not the state, it's you. And so if you're living in a time of discouragement and despair, this is somebody who comes along and offers you some personal solace. And I think it resonates on the same level as the poetry we read from Nguyen Minh Kim. So Christianity starts to make some inroads here. So now we're about 1700. This is a fairly stable time, 1700 to about 1760. No wars. The Nguyen are developing this. There's economic development down here. The Trinh are ruling up here. But in 1765, things start to change for the worse in some way. In 1765, the current Nguyen lord here dies, leaving as the next successor a 12-year-old son, but he's the son of a concubine. His mother was not the queen, she's a lower-ranked woman, so a minister then seizes power within the Nguyen family as regent. A few years later, 3 brothers up in here revolt in the western mountains called the Tay Sung, because the Nguyen power in a way is getting weak. There's no respected lord, nobody has Huy Tin. So these 3 brothers revolt. And one brother is called Nyak, the other is called Lu, and the other is called Hui. And they come down and they seize Quy Nhon in Binh Dinh. And that becomes their base for about 40 years. The Trinh now, up here, see an opportunity to finally defeat their bitter rivals, the Nguyen. Because the Nguyen are weak and they've got a revolt going on down here. So the Trinh form an army and they invade. One of the Tay Sung brothers, Lu, goes down here. He takes an army and goes down here and he captures Saigon. It's actually not Saigon. There are 2 parts to this community. That's the current name for it. But this is where we start to see the southern part of Vietnam for the first time become important in Vietnamese history. Oh, by the way, this area down here was called Cochin China by the West. That was the name given by the Portuguese to the Nguyen zone. But if we go to geomancy, the actual location of Saigon with the French is very badly chosen, because roughly, as I remember it, you get the river that sort of comes down and goes like this. You have the Tingay Canal that comes in here, and there's another canal that comes here. Now, for geomancy, you need a flow of Yang dragon on the left and Yin tiger on the right. So you've got basically a major flow like this. You've got a flow of water here and a flow of water here. So the places where you have a Huyet, you've got a Huyet here, and you got another little Huyet here, where the flows are coming like this. This is a better Huyet. This is called Yadin. This is where, when the first Vietnamese came, they moved here. This is called Ja Lung. This means big market, and this is for the Chinese. Chinese traders are over here. So this real place is not Saigon, it was called Yadin. Now, when the French arrive a long time later, I'm getting a little bit ahead of it, the French build Saigon right here. No Huyet. Lousy place to have a capital, right? No government with its capital in Saigon is going to be a powerful or successful government. The best place in Vietnam for a capital is Hanoi. Even Hue is not very good. Hue is so-so. The problem, and this goes back, by the way, to the problem with President Thieu relocating his grandfather's grave, is that none of the places in Vietnam, all along here, there are no Huyets. There are no big Huyets, because the coast is too narrow. It's too narrow. And the whole flow of yin and yang is going this way and this way. And these are mountains. So Hue is a better location for a Huyet than other places along here. But compared to here, it just doesn't have that. And Thieu's grandfather's grave down in Phan Thiec, here, I've seen the grave. I mean, in that village community, it's probably a pretty good location. but there's no big wit in and under that village, because all the stuff is just kind of flowing right through and continues down south. But that's just traditional Vietnamese thinking. Now, there's some struggles from 1776, 1777, back and forth down here between the Tay Sung brother Lu and the remnants of the Nguyen family. At this point, there's only one Nguyen prince left, and his name is Nguyen Phuc An, and he is trying to figure out how to survive and gain help. He doesn't have a lot of support in Vietnam, so he turns to two sources of foreign power. He turns to the Thai, the Siamese, and he turns to the French. And he has to go to Thailand in exile for a number of years. And there he signs a personal agreement with a Bishop Pignot. And he turns over his eldest son, Prince Khan, to Bishop Pignot. And he asked Bishop Pignot to go to Versailles to get the French king to send aid and army and money to help him reconquer Vietnam for his family. And they do that. And Pignot and Prince Khan arrive in Versailles in 1787 in order to cut an alliance. And a treaty of alliance between the Nguyen family and France is signed. But there are some difficulties in Paris in 1787. One, the French government is basically bankrupt. They've just been fighting the British in the American War. And two, they're 2 years away from a revolution. So this is not good timing to get a French alliance. At the same time, however, back in Vietnam, the brother Nguyen Huê, who's up here, he conquers Hue. And then he starts to move north. And he decides to take on the Trinh. So he takes a group of soldiers from here, and they're moving north, and they're going up, and they defeat the Trinh, and the Trinh lose power. And Nguyen Huê seizes Hanoi. The last Lê emperor, Lê Chiu Thum, then flees over into China. Nguyen Huê goes back down here to central Vietnam, which is their power base. The Lê emperor asks aid from the Chinese. So here we have Nguyen Phuc An down here getting French from the Thai and getting aid from the Thai and the French. The emperor is getting aid from China. Vietnam's destiny is being opened up to foreign powers because these families need help. They don't really have a lot of support among the Vietnamese people, but they have to build up this concept called Tay. Tay is power. If you cannot rule by virtue, Duk, you have to rule by Tay, power. And any Tay will do. Your Tay, the French Tay, the Chinese Tay, as long as it keeps you happy, gets you through the night. The three Tay Sung brothers then divide Vietnam among themselves. Nguyen Huê is the lord of this region, Nguyen Nhac is the lord of this region, and Nguyen Lu is the lord down here. This emerges the tripart division of Vietnam, which becomes important in the 19th and 20th century. Now we have Vietnam quasi-officially divided into Bắc Kỳ, Trung Kỳ, and Nam Kỳ, or Bắc Ha, Nam Ha, and Người Trung. The Chinese Qing dynasty, just as the Ming had done in 1400, they see an opportunity to get re-involved in Vietnam because their recognized ruler, they have recognized the Lê king as the legitimate king of Vietnam. He has been overthrown. He's their ally. They put together an army to restore him on the throne. So in 1787, 1788, a Chinese army comes in here and takes over Hanoi to restore the Lê king. Nguyen Huê is down here, and he doesn't quite know what to do. But he consults with another fortune teller, a guy by the name of La San Phu Tu, Nguyen Thiep, and who tells him that go fight and move fast, because this is at the end of a Mao Tung year. Now, the Mao Tung year is a very powerful year. It's a monkey year. It's a very powerful year for dramatic military activities. It's 1788. And the confluence of yin and yang in a Mao Tung year is favorable if you want to fight and win. So Nguyen Hue gets his soldiers together and by a forced march rushes back up to Hanoi. And on the New Year's going into 1789, which is a Qi Yao year, it's Qi Yao, while the Chinese soldiers are drunk and sleepy from celebrating the New Year, like at dawn, the Vietnamese troops smash into them and kill them all. And it's a huge, great victory. It's the last great victory of the Vietnamese over the Chinese. It's the Battle of Dom Da. And the story is that there were so many dead Chinese that they piled up their bodies and made a big mound. And that mound is still there on the outskirts of Hanoi. You can go see it. Whether there are dead bodies in there, I don't know. I don't think no one has really dug in there to see if they're bones and stuff. But the story is they've got this big monument to Nguyen Hue, Quang Trung, this emperor, and this is the site of his big battle. But at this point, the Chinese pull out. Now, if I may do things, every 60 years, right, is a cycle. The cycle repeats. Every 360 years is a big cycle. If we go from 1788 and we take away 360 years, right, we get, was it 1428? What happened in 1428? The Ming Chinese got defeated and left Vietnam. Another Mao Tung year. Anybody remember a more recent Mao Tung year? 1968. What happened in 1968? On New Year, on the Mao Tung New Year. The communists invaded all of South Vietnam. What was the name that the communists gave to their military campaign of Tet Mao Tung? It was the Nguyen Hue campaign. Because Yap, who's a professor of history, remembered Nguyen Hue defeating the Chinese by attacking Tet when everybody was asleep and off. And he said, we're going to do the same thing to the South Vietnamese and Americans. When there's a truce, when everybody is at home, celebrating the New Year with their family, we're going to attack. And just as Nguyen Hue defeated the foreign invader, we're going to do it. But in the Tet Mao Tung attack of '68, they only went after the South Vietnamese forces. They didn't attack any of the Americans. They only attacked South Vietnamese units, police units, military headquarters. And the interesting thing is, it didn't work. So, on whose side was heaven in 1968? Which way was yin and yang flowing in 1968? Was not flowing in the direction of the communists. But this notion of Nguyen Hue in a Mao Tung year, right at the end of a Mao Tung year, just flipping over the cusp, defeating the Chinese, is powerful within Vietnamese memories. Now, Nguyen Hue is a very controversial figure, I understand, in Vietnamese history. He is a great hero to many and not so great to others. He's a great hero to nationalists. He was picked up by Ho Chi Minh as a great, and the communists played him up as a great peasant leader, coming from a farm sort of poor background here to rise up to defend the people. But we don't know much about his reign. One of the reasons why is his son loses out to this guy, the descendant of the Nguyen family who's down here. And the Nguyen are going to conquer all of Vietnam and establish their own dynasty in 1802. One of the things the Nguyen do is they try to absolutely obliterate all evidence and trace and records of the Tay Sung family and records. And so the graves of the Tay Sung were dug up, the bones were smashed, all relatives were killed, records were burned. So we don't know a lot, but it appears that Nguyen Hue, in his court, he used the Nome writing. He did not use the official Chinese, the Han Văn, the Chinese characters. He had a Vietnamese nationalist sense. The feeling of those people who admire Nguyen Hue is that he was trying to restore something of this Vietnamese-ness of the Li, of the Trung, of the early Lê dynasty, and push away this Chinese, sort of this imperial Chinese formalism, which had come in under the Trinh. And he also, the records indicate, was trying to revive Buddhism, which had been persecuted for about 200 years. He gave orders that every district should build a big Buddhist temple. He searched to have the monks who had deep understanding of the scriptures and had high qualities of personal virtue, that such men were to be come in and made abbots of these temples. So he wanted to use Nome, and he wanted to use Buddhism. Now, this is a study, historical study from the 1930s, done by Wa's sort of uncle, Wang Sunhan, about La Sang Futu, who is the teacher, the poet, the fortune teller, who told Wing Wei to attack very quickly in this Mao Tung year. And at the end of this, Professor Hung was able to find a number of official documents from the king, Wing Wei, Quang Trung, which are written in Nome. So there is some evidence that he actually used this very Vietnamese script. And the difference is, in this Vietnamese script, you speak Vietnamese. If you use Han Dynasty script, you speak it out as Chinese. So it's different words and different meaning and different grammar. If you go from a Han script, you have to then translate it back into Vietnamese. So if your court issues all its orders and laws in Han Dynasty script, the ordinary Vietnamese can't understand it. And that's why if you go in history books, you will find two sections. You will find the document written in Han Chinese, and then there'll be a section called Phiên which means translated over into Vietnamese pronunciation and grammar. So there's some instances that Wing Wei had a very different philosophy, not a Neo-Confucian Chinese philosophy, something that was much more organically Vietnamese. But he couldn't set up a dynasty. So there is a range of Vietnamese opinion, I understand, that said he really wasn't that favored by heaven. If he had been truly favored by heaven, he could have set up a dynasty. But he died, there was only a young son. His wife's brother, the same old ancient pattern in Vietnam, on the maternal side, the mother of the son, she begins to use her brother to try to control the court. Other mandarins in the court don't like this. They leave, they fight among themselves, their power weakens. Wing Wei's two brothers, Nyak and Lu, fight among themselves, die early. The movement kind of breaks down, and the Nguyen family from the south takes advantage of this, and with French help, we'll talk about this next time, moves back. So Wing Wei might have beaten the Chinese, he might have had great aspirations, he might have had a good character, but somehow heaven did not really favor him or Vietnam at that point. So we are left with basically three great heroes. Ly Tung Kiet, under the lead who defeated the Chinese. He was not king, but he defeated the Chinese, and he had that great character. We have Trung Hung Dao, the prince under the Trung dynasty, who defeated the Mongols 3 times, once or twice by himself, the other time with help. And then we have Lê Lai, who founded the Lê dynasty and who defeated the Ming dynasty. And we have Wing Wei, who defeated the Qing dynasty, but because of these issues, he could not create a dynasty. He's sort of, not everybody puts him up in the top rank. The other thing I feel, however, is that the propaganda of the Nguyen dynasty was so negative towards Quang Trung Wing Wei that a lot of Vietnamese in the 19th century and early 20th century just kind of had that sense that, well, it must have been something about him. My own feeling is that it was probably a tragedy for the Vietnamese people that he died so young, because there seems to be enough evidence that he understood in a different way how you mobilize, how you inspire Vietnamese, how you put together an organized state. So now we have come down to 1802, which is the end of this period of factional fighting and struggle among families. One of the 4 families, the Nguyen dynasty, which rule this part, has come back to control all of Vietnam and establish the Nguyen dynasty. So next time we're going to talk about the fate of the Nguyen dynasty, which was not a happy one, because within 58 years or so, the French arrive and start imposing French colonialism. And then, so next time we'll talk about the Nguyen, the arrival of French colonialism, and the response of the Vietnamese to the French and how they thought about their Nguyen rulers. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.